Okay, everyone. So let me start off by apologizing to you. Everybody here on the team was on time, and some things that do not depend on our action delayed us a bit, but it's good to be back. So here's the deal. The idea in this afternoon session is to have, again, a very open debate. If you guys want to come over to the front desk or closer if you want, it's to have a very open debate about some of the issues which have been intriguing or interesting us studying Shakespeare literature and political theory and law. But instead of asking professors to ask the questions or to tell us what they find interesting, the afternoon session should be, the start will be with students, right, that are working, are in a way starting their work with Shakespeare political theory and law. And I have here one question by Lucas that was that had to do with some of the topics we talked about in the morning. It starts at 3 o'clock? Yes. So I don't apologize. Why am I had 2:30. Okay, so I'll take that apology back. Okay, I'll use it some other time. Okay, so maybe we can start with Lucas. And I see Marina that has a very similar topic to Lucas, right? To the things that Lucas are interested in. So the idea is that students ask their questions or present their doubts or difficulties or points they find worth debating, and then everybody jumps in and discusses them. Okay? You ready to start, Lucas? You okay? And then Marina, maybe you can do this. Okay, right.
My question is, looking at Shakespeare's play Richard V, and the role of Henry, and the role of marriage in the play, in a way that marriage guarantees sovereignty to a state, in a way, to two states, and looking at another play, Midsummer's Night Dream, where the marriage, actually the sovereignty in marriage, actually comes from Hermia, in which she is demanding her sovereignty of her body and her free will to marry whoever she wants. And my question is that a case of two contrasting and debating ideas of a medieval Shakespeare and a modern Shakespeare, a Shakespeare that is looking at medieval issues and modern issues too? Is that the case or not?
That you point to something very, very interesting in Midsummer Night's Dream, where the daughter looks like she's completely a victim of a patriarchal system. And the system has a gap in it. It is like Elizabethan marriage customs where marriages get arranged by parents, especially by fathers. And daughters have a right technically to veto the selection of a husband that the father gives. But as in the case of Romeo and Juliet, the parents can tighten the screws and coerce the daughter. What Hermia does, I'm looking for the passage that you're referring to, where she talks about, she uses the word sovereignty, right? Where she talks about sovereignty as something that she gives to a husband. That's in marriage the equivalent of popular sovereignty, where the people give sovereignty to a ruler. So there's a different political model there in marriage, and there's a different politics and political ideology for the state. That's a very interesting case where Shakespeare says, you think you're looking at something where this young woman is victimized. She's the typical oppressed woman under the control of her father, and it's going to pass to the control of her husband. But she asserts a right to give sovereignty. Otherwise, it's not going to be given. It's not going to be possessed by the person who is her husband. Yeah, and that, to us, it looks very modern. But to some extent, it's based on the system where people have spiritual autonomy as individual Christians, and they can't be coerced beyond a certain point. Yeah. I don't know if you have thoughts on this one.
I also think it's an interesting question, and I guess I would say, with the medieval versus early modern, I mean, one way of telling the story of marriage is to say it's really with John Milton in the 1650s that you get the emergence of real notions of companionate marriage. So John Milton writes his Doctrine of Discipline and Divorce, in which he argues that being married to somebody who's your intellectual inferior is a form of slavery, and so, in fact, marriages should be companions. They should be between two equal people. So historians of marriage will often say that Shakespeare is working not with the companionate model of marriage, but with an older model of property-based marriage, family-based marriage. But I think you're right, and so I think that dovetails with what Arthur's suggesting, which is that there's a sort of desire, perhaps, to imagine that Hermia is really arguing for a kind of self-sovereignty that is a little bit more complicated than the individual. But I think, to build on his point, on the other hand, Shakespeare's operating within a tradition that very much suggests, well, the soul is inviolable, and you don't want to damage your soul in a certain kind of marriage. And also, I might say, kind of in a different tack, theatrically, so many of Shakespeare's plays depend on, even if it's a dynastic marriage, us imagining that the woman is very happy with the marriage that's resulted. So thinking about something like The Tempest, where, to a certain extent, Prospero arranges the marriage between Ferdinand and Miranda. He puts up some blockages, but he really stage manages that. But we want to imagine, and in fact we do imagine, and the play depends on us believing that Miranda and Ferdinand are perfect for each other. And similarly in a play like Merchant of Venice, where we see Portia's father having controlled her through the will, and in certain, she bristles against this, saying, "Oh, that I'm subjected to my father's will." On the other hand, the outcome of that play, we're meant to imagine that she really gets the man of her dreams in Bassanio. I mean, why anybody would want Bassanio is beyond me. I think he's like one of the biggest cads in Shakespeare. But but nonetheless, Portia seems quite happy with him. And I think we can, I was just doing a list, and I think Juliet's another example where there's family involvement. But nonetheless, so I think you're actually right. Even if marriage historians tell us that companionate marriage doesn't really appear until later, Shakespeare is working with a model, as Arthur's suggesting, where our happiness with these plays depends on the fact that we think these women are making informed, adequate choices.
Let me read the passage you're referring to, because it has something else in it that's very interesting from a legal point of view. She's being coerced by the ruler, Theseus, to obey her father and accept the husband that's been picked for her. She says, in effect, if you don't accept this, you're going to have to be condemned forever to be unmarried, to live in what he calls single blessedness. She says, "So will I grow, so live, so die, my lord, ere I will yield my virgin patent up unto his lordship, whose unwished yoke my soul consents not to give sovereignty." There are two languages here. A language of patent is one where in the society economically, people are given the right to have a certain kind of economic activity under their control. The monarch typically gave out patents, there was a patent given out by the monarchy for printing law books, for example.
It's we in Brazilian history, you have the idea dos monopólios, que você vendia monopólio, então monopólio.
All right. She's saying, by referring to her virginity as a patent, a virgin patent, she's saying, I own the rights to my body. That's a very important assertion there. But she also says she's not going to yield up, she consents not to give sovereignty over her to, and that's another language, that's again the political language of popular sovereignty. So she's saying in two respects, she owns herself. She owns her body, but she also owns the right to rule her that would be delegated to a husband only by free consent. So in the notion of popular sovereignty, if the populace does not yield the sovereignty to a ruler, that's an illegitimate ruler. That's a usurper. So those two languages come together in what she says. Yeah.
Can I jump in just because there's something very interesting there that you're saying? I mean, actually, a number of very interesting things. It's a very good thing that Lucas brought up. When you say that she has a right to her body, I don't know whether, could we say that she has what is a resistance right, but not an active right, in the sense that she's not free to actually go out and choose or act her sexuality, so to speak. But her right is to resist someone she cannot, she does not like. I'm trying to make, because I think obviously this relates to the contractual theories of political theories later on. So I think there's a very important thing here, which is the place of choice, and whether choice is legitimate and what makes choice legitimate. That's one thing. Now, but when you talk about, I like very much what you said about she has a right to her body, but to a certain extent, maybe it is a negative right. So that would perhaps dialogue with the resistant theories or not?
I think she owns her body. There's a famous essay done by a feminist scholar about the exchange of women, about in cultures where women are commodities that are exchanged between men. In the case of marriage, they're exchanged between a father and a prospective husband. What she's saying is that I'm not a commodity, I own myself. And I have the right to give up that right of ownership to a husband. So it's not simply a negative right. It's if you're going to talk about commodification of the person, she's sort of twisting it around to saying, I own myself. I'm not owned by somebody else to be exchanged the way people exchange women in these social transactions that are part of arranged marriages.
Right, yeah.
I mean, one thing that strikes me, and I'd be really curious to hear what, if any of the rest of you want to weigh in on this, what you think, but one peculiar thing is that, and this maybe is just my reading of Midsummer Night's Dream, but Hermia and Helena, I mean, it's a funny play for her to be the one who's saying I have sovereignty over my body, because unlike, say, Portia or Rosalind or Viola, right, who are really rich female characters, I have to confess I sort of think of Hermia and Helena as, I mean, right, isn't the whole thing that they actually are interchangeable enough that, Puck puts on the thing and then all of a sudden it's like all the couples are mixed up. So it's quite ironic that he's giving a kind of articulation of female sovereignty in the mouth of a character who is somewhat interchangeable with another female character. I wonder what it would be like to have that same speech kind of put in the lips of, like I say, one of these richer characters. But others of you might disagree with that reading of Midsummer.
Well, she's a very feisty woman. Here she is facing down her father and the ruler of the state. That's not wishy-washy. That's not milquetoast.
No, it's true.
And she's talked about as feisty later on, as she used to be scrappy when she was a young girl. And Helena reminds the audience of this. Yeah.
But Helena also is scrappy, She chases the three of them to the, that's not a trivial thing to do.
She also says to Demetrius, I'm your spaniel, beat me.
That's true.
But let me go back to maybe I really want to understand this better. Okay, within the laws of Athens, she has a choice. right? She can either marry the matrizes, right? Or she can die a virgin.
No,
within the law.
The original alternative is either married or be executed. The third possibility is go to a nunnery.
Okay.
That gets raised. That's the one that's chosen.
Okay, but what is not in the menu for her? Just pretty much like ours over land, very limited the menu. Okay, what is not in the manual for her is, okay, you have the right to choose your husband. It's not in the play, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that it's maybe this early modern political theory is more equipped to talk about resisting some sort of government than putting up some sort of government. So I think that's very important because, and I think that the seeds of the new way of government, the contractual theories, and that we have to have a social contract, so on and so forth, are already there in the sense that I have to like my husband. I have to like of my husband, right? So, but I think it's not irrelevant that hers is basically a right to resist more than a right to affirm. But I'm not sure that this makes sense.
So are you saying it's like a Bentham, like freedom from rather than freedom to? So rather than freedom to choose the husband she wants, she has freedom from.
Right. Right. The same way that I think that people could overthrow a tyrant, and that would not make them legitimate to decide who the next ruler is going to be.
Yeah. Your formulation is the way they would have understood most contractual marriage situations. The right to veto the selection of a husband is a negative kind of thing. Right. She's asserting something much more. She's saying, I own myself and I give sovereignty. That's way beyond the usual system. The usual system would have been recognized as, well, we have to concede that if she finds this choice so repugnant and so awful and she'll fight it to the death, it'll make a bad marriage, so we better give her a veto. Right. But it's more than just a negative veto that she has.
May I just say something?
Oh.
I was trying not to. Well, for somebody who doesn't know anything about law, as you guys know, but I am a 19th century literature scholar. I was thinking it over as you were talking about this thing of this, let's say, side character, but still a woman, telling everybody what she wants and what she doesn't want. In the middle of the 16th century. In a way, I think this is absolutely extraordinary because it tends to be seen, I think that's something we can say, as an anticipation of the 19th century woman heroine from romantic novels. Women who, for the first time in bourgeois societies, would tell their fathers or would tell their patrons what they wanted. And what they wanted with their body, what they wanted, the husbands they wanted, if they wanted to get married, and so on and so forth. Which already anticipated what we know women were able to do only in the 20th century. Because still in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, in some societies, including here in Brazil, many women were actually incapable of choosing their husbands. Right? Perhaps many of you know stories in your families. Your great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers who perhaps suffered from arranged marriages. So we're talking about Shakespeare, and we're talking about the 16th century. And then all of a sudden, in a world where things were still being built, things were still being organized, we have modernity right there. So I don't know, I tend to see a clear dialogue here between this character and women in novels such as Wuthering Heights, for example, or Jane Eyre, or any other of the romantic novels we know. British novels, Portuguese novels as well. So I don't know. It's something
the trouble is, Shakespeare does not romanticize this. As the play develops, she wants Lysander, her father wants Demetrius. Both right. Lysander and Demetrius are idiots.
Right. No, I know. It's much more dopes. Like, I know. It's more pragmatic. That's the way it is. It's not romantic at all. It's pragmatic. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't know. I tend to see this intertextual dialogue right there.
Yeah. The only caveat I might put on that is that in the case of something like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, I think part of what is so revolutionary about the woman's choice has to do, I mean, at least in Jane Eyre, I suppose, has to do with class. and the way in which marriage is crossing class lines, which is not something Shakespeare does, which is quite interesting, because even when you have a character like Olivia in Twelfth Night, who imagines that she's falling in love with the serving man of the Count, or of Orsino, in fact, it ends up being a marriage that is within class. So that might just be, in terms of thinking about marriage, to think about the way in which class does enter into the kind of imaginative possibilities.
Sure, please.
Permita-me fazer a pergunta em português por insegurança também.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Não podemos negligenciar que, se regredirmos na história, no surgimento da comédia nova, ela se diferencia da comédia antiga justamente pela oposição entre pares românticos e pela negativa, muitas vezes, no direito de a mulher casar com uma pessoa ou outra, que vai se tornar o mote da comédia.
Okay, so you're saying that if we go back in comedy, you were saying that the change from the commedia, the old comedy and the new comedy, is the fact that the plot of the new comedy has to do with the will or the right of a woman to choose her partner. That was not there before, and he's going to come.
Normalmente temos na intriga da comédia nova uma mulher de uma classe social suspeita e um homem de uma classe social alta e consolidada, ateniense, e eles dialogam por essa escolha. Será que não seria simplesmente um aproveitamento de uma forma consolidada?
Você está falando da comédia grega?
Isso, e depois do aproveitamento por Shakespeare.
Okay, you're saying that in Greek comedy, oftentimes you have a lower class or dubious class woman playing with a upper class man, and the tension is there, their relationship. And he says that, well, couldn't, in a way, Shakespeare be reenacting this problem of a problematic feminine will that was already present in earlier plays? Okay, yeah. In Greek theater.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, in something like Comedy of Errors, or the plays of Shakespeare's that, for example, are drawing from Plautus, I think you do see this. And in fact, there's a very good book by this woman, Lorna Hudson. It's called The Invention of Suspicion, and it's a book that is about literature, law, and Shakespeare. And in it, she talks about actually the shared origins of law and literature, including Shakespeare, in comedy, in comedic rhetoric. So anyway, I think it's quite a rich question that you're asking, and I don't have a particularly brilliant answer, but I do think that issue of kind of Roman new comedy is just quite a rich one, and it just happens to be one that a number of law and literature people have taken up.
Let me say something sociological here. In the theater, there are a lot of younger sons. In a country where the system is primogeniture, the firstborn son inherits almost all the property. All the younger sons have to scramble professionally. They have to go into the military. They have to go into law. They have to attach themselves as educated men to aristocratic patrons, whatever. One of the things that they aspire to is striking it rich. And what you get in Shakespeare's romantic comedies very often is a fantasy of a young man somehow striking it rich, marrying a rich heiress like Portia, or a countess like Olivia. It looks like a move upward in class for the male that's celebrated. So you can have both money and a beautiful woman at the same time, and that will solve your economic problems for being down and out. So I think when people go to the theater, they realize this is a fantasy. The real world doesn't really work like this. But it's a pleasurable fantasy to offer to an audience that has a lot of young men who don't have great prospects economically because their older brothers have inherited the main estates. And they have to, the system has to work by primogeniture. Otherwise, an aristocratic family will suddenly get their holdings divided again and again and again and again, and very soon you're down to 40 acres and a mule. So the system has to operate by primogeniture. But the fantasies that primogeniture causes are catered to by the theater, which will show you young men making their way by their wits, lucking into a relationship with a woman who's rich and beautiful at the same time.
Just before I think we pass on to Marina, I mean, let's just ask you a really information question. Of course, Shakespeare usually talks about upper class marriage, right? In which the desired individual will is problematic because there are implications for your choice, right, when you get married. And this is true also in political history that, I mean, you don't choose. I mean, princes cannot choose their spouses. It's a political thing. How is it in terms of the lower classes? Would people have more freedom? And if so, what would be the implications in terms of the perception of the place of the will? I think that's one very important thing in the 17th century. Well, the will. Let's have the free will, or will is something negative or positive, etc. So if we are saying that upper class women have to, and also men, have to face the limits to their will, what was happening to lower class people, and how would that affect their perception of will? Will there be a class divide between the lived experience of your possibility of fulfilling yourself through marriage or not?
Let me say something that the social historians have said about marriage. The poorer you are, the later you get married. Now, this might seem obvious, right? You can't get married unless you have the economic resources to have a spouse and a family. So at the same time, extramarital births are punished in the culture. There's no effective birth control to speak of. So there's a kind of necessity for sexual policing that's built into, and shaming rituals built into the culture. I suppose the lower down in the social hierarchy you are, the less arranged marriage matters. What you have in the case of aristocrats getting married is something like a corporate merger. You have a lot of real estate at stake, and there are combining of properties that are involved, so that the upper class wants to keep things in their own circle, in their own power range, and they want to keep estates together or even build on them, and marriage is one way of doing this. If you have two people who are dirt poor, it doesn't matter. One poor person marrying another poor person, sure, let them choose. There may be parents who want to govern that choice, but it matters less, and there's less urgency, less economic and social urgency to control it from the top, I think.
Anyway, so I think there's many interesting questions that could still go on here. Again, how this affects, I mean, this possibility, once you have nothing to lose, you can choose, right, whomever you want, and how this, the political implications of that. And also, another interesting thing would be whether Protestant and Catholic mentality would affect this in any way, would say this. But now we have a very interesting question by Marina, right? Who's working with Hamlet and the moral problems attached to revenge. Marina, can you help us, please? Lucas, passar o microfone para Marina, por favor. Obrigado. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Marina.
Just as Professor Garces has mentioned, I think my research has very similarities with Lucas's, because we're talking about two institutes. I'm thinking about revenge, he's thinking about marriage, or even the role of women in society. So they're both very interesting institutes, and I think that a more general perspective that we can look at it is the evolution of those institutes, because Hamlet is a very transitional character, so he's both in the medieval side and both in the modern side, so he does have some dilemmas, very important questions concerning how to make this transition. So the question I would like to ask you is, does this institutes, just as revenge and marriage, how do you interpret them? Is it possible to see how do they connect in this new legal framework? Because, well, we've been discussing this the whole morning, the question of how the medieval way of thinking focused a lot on morality, and how the modern way of thinking, it's a little bit more about a procedure and how did we get there. So if Hamlet is so, and this his questioning himself, how do I do that in this new world? How do I proceed? So how can we see those new those institutes? They're old, but how can we see them in this new world that has been created? Just as I've mentioned, the early modern England. So how can we?
Yeah, thank you for the interesting question. And then you might answer and I might come back. But what comes to me, I mean, one way of answering that question, all right, there are two things that immediately come to mind. One is the early modern opposition of perhaps something like the Old Testament to the New Testament. So where does justice come from? And I think, at least according to Christian early modern England/Europe, there's a critique of the revenge ethos on the grounds that it's an Old Testament eye for an eye model of justice that is no longer appropriate in a Christian universe where one imagines that justice lies in the hands of God. So that the dilemma that Hamlet is caught in is having from the grave, literally the kind of voice of the medieval knighted past, come to him and say, I'm offering this old model of justice, eye for an eye, smite mine enemy. And Hamlet saying, wait a minute, I've been trained in Wittenberg. I'm part of this new Protestant moment. What about the condition of my soul? Okay, so that's one way of answering the question, is that, which feeds along the timeline you're talking about, that revenge is suddenly called into question when you have a different idea of where justice, and not just justice, but justice tempered with mercy comes from. The second point, which is a more theatrical answer to your question, might be that in a medieval theatrical model, you would have a character like Vindici. You would have a character of revenge who would be on the stage, and you would then have other characters like a good and a bad angel, the figure of revenge, the figure of whatever, whoever else, every man, right? But in Shakespeare's theater, you could say that he combines these stock characters to create a kind of psychological richness that means that Hamlet has these competing stock character impulses in him, which are, on the one hand, I have to be the character revenge, and on the other hand, I have to be the character everyman. And so what we see is one character condensing in him, then competing responses to revenge, which create the kind of famous delay, which I would say, despite Freud's argument, is actually a sign of his humanity. Like, to the extent that he's able to hold off murdering someone, congratulations. I don't really think we have to analyze that as some defect.
There's an easy answer to the whole question of revenge. It's good theater. There's a reason why revenge plays were popular in the 1590s and so. It's good action, good suspense, got good blood and gore kind of dimension to it. Who wouldn't like that? It's like a good Clint Eastwood movie. Revenge is called rough justice, and it is recognized as rough justice. It's not a sophisticated, civilized justice system. But to some extent, Shakespeare is reflecting, again, I want to get back to the social context of his time, he's reflecting on a social problem that still exists. He's in a Christian culture which operates in terms of conscience and morality, and good and bad, and the teachings of Jesus. But he's also operating within a culture of kind of elite honor codes. And when you have a culture of honor, where what matters most is keeping face, not being shamed, Then you've got a different moral code operating. You do the thing that avoids being shameful. And if an honor code demands that you retaliate against someone who has injured you personally, how you go about it or how much overboard you go in inflicting violence or retaliation on that person isn't so important. The Christian moral code sort of recedes to the background. There are lots of aristocrats in Shakespeare's England who are operating on this code primarily. There are lots of, and Shakespeare reflects this in Romeo and Juliet, there are lots of aristocrats who are having family feuds and having their liveried retainers battle with one another outside the law, outside of the code of Christian behavior. So this still exists as a system, despite the fact that it's recognized as primitive and outdated and superseded by Christian morality. But so long as you have a culture that cares a lot about honor and shame more than it does about right and wrong or just and unjust, then you're going to have that friction there. And Shakespeare's working, as you say, with the friction between those kinds of codes. Yeah.
I just would like to just bring about two themes that I clearly see in the play. The first one would be about the last scene, because Hamlet, before he dies, he asks Horatio, please, I want you to live. Don't die because of me, because Horatio is about to sacrifice himself. But then he said, I need you to tell the story. I need you to tell people why I did that. So I see a very clear question of legitimacy, of how does he legitimate his acts? Why did I act like this? Why did I have to be vengeful? Why did I have to murder a king? So I think this is a very important point, and I think it's a little bit connected with the second point I'd like to bring. It's also how did we pass to the point in which before we had knights responsible for a certain code of honor, as you mentioned. They were supposed to be honorable, they're supposed to be respectful. They had this very particular code of honor. And then we passed to a point in which the state is responsible for resolving problems, deal with violence. The state is responsible for holding together violence. So whenever something happens against the law, it's up to the state, not up to knights to deal with it. So I think it's a very interesting point, because you see in the play characters with this very ancient medieval code of honor, and then we see characters very interested in how to legitimize this process, how do the state must deal with all this question of vengeance and violence and etc. So
one of the things to note about Hamlet is that his behavior and his attitudes change after he gets back from his trip to England. Before he goes, including the scene in which he sees Claudius, as it seems to be, praying. Claudius is unable to pray. It's all ego-centered. It's, now might I be revenged. After that, he says things like, if it be now, I'm paraphrasing badly, it'll be now, if not, whatever. He's saying it's going to happen whenever it happens. He's saying there's providence in the fall of a sparrow. He's leaving himself open to, in a way, to being acted through in a process of bringing a certain kind of justice. It's not ego-satisfying revenge that's at the center of his being at that point. And so much is accidental toward the end of Hamlet. So it's accidental that he gets Laertes' sword that's poisoned and kills Laertes and then kills Claudius with it. It's not he has to accept the fact that he can't control everything at that point. But he's not like that earlier. Earlier, he wants to be able to control everything, wants to make certain that the ghost is telling the truth, wants to make certain that Claudius is guilty. So it's a different Hamlet in the last part of the play that we encounter. He's more resigned, he's more accepting, he's more open to things that happen out of his control.
Which is an interesting point. I mean, because revenge in a certain sense requires the ability to say, I am an actor in the cause of justice. And I think that what you're suggesting is that he gets to the point of saying, the readiness is all. There's providence in the fall of a sparrow. I'm a vessel for something else to act through. And so, I mean, you could actually make the argument that the play is suggesting an earlier model of revenge in which you have a character who says, it's up to me, just as you're saying, the ego, I am the actor, is then superseded by precisely that model of some sort of divine justice operating through Hamlet, that he's allowing chance, coincidence, providence to suddenly use him as the mechanism, but that it's no longer. So that, in other words, that change in Hamlet could be exactly the change from a kind of Old Testament to New Testament, or from revenge to something else, providence. The other thing I was just going to say is there are a couple of interesting books that make an argument about the shift from honor codes to the state, or as one of these books, the title is from courtesy to civility, and it's about the move from the honor code to a sense of citizenship and civility. Another book is some of you might know Norbert Elias's book, The Civilizing Process, that talks about the acquisition of manners. But along with this is the idea of moving from honor to again, a certain kind of state citizenry where there are new codes of behaviors in which there's a kind of deference to some developing state mechanism. I mean, that's what's amazing about the early modern period, is that so many of the things that we might take for granted as features of the state just don't exist. You know, substantial taxation policies, standing armies, any kind of developed mail system, distribution of resources. You know, these are things that are slowly getting developed. This is the kind of social history angle that Arthur's been talking about.
I think that Marina mentioned the final dialogue with Horatio, in which he says that it's really a shame that he's dying and nobody will really know not only the story itself, but I think that at least this is my reading of this dialogue. It will be difficult for posterity, for the history, to know the reasons, the justification of that revenge, of that whole story. And so I think that this also somehow Shakespeare is teasing the audience to think again about the reasoning of the previous reasonings of Hamlet. I mean, the reasons he had not to act, and how were the political reasons he had, and also the psychological ones that he has.
The request is a simple one. Tell my story.
Yes.
But that's a tricky one. You cannot tell the story of Hamlet without interpreting it. You cannot tell it without interpreting his motivations, whether they're good or bad, justified or unjustified. You know, whether his view of the politics of Denmark is accurate.
It's a way to invite the audience. Think again from the very beginning. Right. Read it again.
Right. I think that as always, Ronaldo brings a very interesting point, and I am puzzled by Hamlet being less determined in a way, or less personal after his trip to England, because that's when he's certain that Claudius is up to no good, right? And so I'm wondering whether there's not a tricky thing that he does in here, which is he says that, okay, whatever Providence wants will happen, but we know almost for certain that Providence will want what he wants to do. We don't expect Providence to have Claudius acclaimed as a great king. So I think it might be interesting. I was thinking about the Puritan movement here in the years preceding the Revolution, in which you're saying that you are the locus of the will of God and not the sovereign. And this is totally different. So, and I think that's because in the beginning, I mean, before he goes to England, maybe he still believes that there's this medieval structure that he has to be very certain, because spirits like his father can be sent from hell to make lose his soul, so on and so forth. But I don't buy very much that Hamlet does not care what's going to happen, right? No, I know. I mean, we're saying, okay, I have the readiness. The readiness is all. But I'm thinking whether maybe I'm reading too much into that. But I think that's an important shifting here, in the sense that, okay, there is this will of God is not necessarily, it can be in Hamlet somewhere else, away from the sovereign. And I think that a lot of the Protestant theoretical response to ways of resisting the crown and justifying their own movements is that we are acting the will of God. We know the will of God, and we are the locus of the will of God. And I think that, in a way, I mean, they take the locus of the will of God away from the king to the rightful prince or rightful citizen, and then they will take away the word God and will do the will of the citizens and so forth, and will have modernity. So I don't know whether you think that by the end of the play, I mean, this idea that the locus of the legitimate will has shifted, and that might explain why he's so intent on Horatio trying to justify his actions. I don't know.
Well, one response I have is just James has the phrase "no bishop, no king," because precisely one of the really threatening things about the Reformation, particularly as it was then carried out by the Puritans, is the elimination of hierarchy in the name of grace, so that with everybody, and Luther writes about this in this really fascinating debate that he has with Erasmus, where in the Luther-Erasmus debates, Luther talks about being struck by lightning. His authority, his religious authority, comes from this lightning bolt moment in which he is suddenly authorized to be speaking through having engaged with the Bible. And so, James says, look, you eliminate my ecclesiastical hierarchy, you're really getting rid of me too. So he recognizes it as a challenge to sovereignty. But I do think, at least as I heard Arthur saying, and as I was suggesting, it's not that he doesn't care, but it is, I think, as Arthur put it, a shift away from an ego-based model of justice, where, I'm carrying out justice in my name, to instead something broader, like a recourse to grace or truth or a sense of kind of rightness. I mean, this is what you're suggesting, that he can give up control precisely because he's now confident that the right end will appear. He knows the truth, and he's operating in its name.
And when he refuses to kill Claudius, he says, he's working out in his head, if Claudius is praying and if he's made his peace with God and I kill him, what kind of revenge is it? He said, and so then I am revenged? Is that how I'm going to get my revenge? But it's not his revenge to get. It's not a personal thing. He's trying to right a wrong and correct things in the state by killing Claudius. The attitude he has late is, it's not a question of my getting revenge. It's a question of my leaving myself as an instrument for God to work out things in the state. Now, the state's a failed state at the end of Hamlet, and it gets taken over by a foreigner, although it's a foreigner who has Hamlet's dying breath, the way King James had Elizabeth's dying breath as a successor. That would have, later on, that would have been resonant, I think, not at that point in 1599, but later on. Everybody was worrying whom she would name as her successor. That's an issue. The succession issue was very hot in the 1590s.
You'll hear a lot about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one last question? Because I think during a certain point in the morning, you've mentioned that Hamlet's king killing, there should be a general consent that Claudius was the tyrant so that he could pursue his actions. So do you think that maybe this last scene with Hamlet, please let let the people know why I did that has something to do with this general consent of people
I think
knowing.
so. Making it, socializing what went on and having people reflect on it, yes, is to take it away from just his personal mission. Yes, I think that's true. Yeah.
Yep. Luis, you want to present your question? Yep.
So I'm actually doing my research on the same play, on Hamlet too, but on a different theme. I'm researching the suicide aspect on Hamlet, and also in other Shakespeare plays. And you can see that in most of his plays, 1, 2, or even 5 characters commit suicide. And till this century, the suicide had a religious aspect. From St. Augustine, you can see that there is no clear prohibition in the Bible, but St. Augustine says that you cannot do it based on God's commandments.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's no judgment on the suicide on the place. Like there's no, is it right or wrong? The characters commit suicide, and then my question is, considering the law and the thought at the time, are the plays adiantadas, estão à frente do seu tempo?
Are they more modern than the time? Are they ahead of their time?
How dare you attack her? She was wonderful. She was moral, and don't let your religious rules keep her from having a respectful burial. So there's a calling into question of the Christian blanket judgment that all suicides are acts of murder. They're self-murder, self-slaughter, Hamlet uses as a term. And there's also a questioning of the fact that what a suicidal person does is commit one of the 2 unforgivable sins. There are 2 unforgivable sins, presumption and despair. Presumption is the believer saying, I don't need God. I do everything on my own. Despair says, I'm not worthy of God's grace, so I shut the door to God's grace. And an act of suicide is looked upon as a commission of the deadly sin of despair. I think that's called into question, certainly in the play. And he's being more context sensitive about why Ophelia died. So there is something more modern about that. And it's saying that, in effect, the hard and fast kinds of rules about suicides, they're mortal sins, they're damnable sins that send you straight to hell, that you shouldn't be buried in a Christian burial ground. There's something wrong with that.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question on a couple of levels. One is, right, as Arthur's suggesting, there's this tension, and I think as you're suggesting, there's a tension between, on the one hand, the suicide prohibition, and on the other hand, the articulation by people like Shakespeare in Hamlet or by John Donne in By Athanatos of at least some, if not, for John Donne, an active defense of the right of suicide. But in Shakespeare, arguably also that sense of self-sovereignty that says, my body and my soul doesn't necessarily belong to the state that might legislate things, or maybe even to a particular articulation of God in the form of a church. One thing that comes to mind is I actually, within the last year, heard a paper that was on Montaigne, and a Montaigne manuscript that has been relocated in the Vatican that is a defense of suicide. It was something that had been on the register of censored texts, the index that had been on the index and then has been located. And And so it's this kind of historical irony that you guys might realize, that these texts that are put on the index and that are censored are often the only reason they're saved is because, in fact, they were censored. So, you know, the Vatican archives are so fantastic because they're basically a treasure trove of all sorts of, you know, pornography and heretical views. And so one of these things is this Montaigne treatise that is a defense of suicide. And the terms of Montaigne's defense, this was also a paper that actually brought in Hamlet, because Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. Okay, yes, we have the example of Ophelia, and she can't be buried in hollow ground because of the potential for her suicide. But in Hamlet's to be or not to be speech, he says, you know, who would not his quietus make with a bare bodkin? Except for the fear of that undiscovered country from whose something no traveler has returned. And so he's not saying, and I think, so this issue of the undiscovered country becomes an important interpretive question. Is the undiscovered country hell? Who would not his quietus make with a bare bodkin except for the fear of the undiscovered country, i.e. damnation? Or is it that one just doesn't know what happens to us? And so he's not saying that I'm afraid of suicide because I'm afraid I'm going to be damned. He's saying I'm afraid of suicide because I really just don't know where I'm going to go. And that is a really different argument. And that's an argument that basically is saying I'm considering killing myself, and the primary concern on my mind is not damnation, but it's something else. And so I think that's just really interesting support for your argument if you're tracing suicide and suggesting maybe there's an emergence of something that is a challenge to St. Augustine. So, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Eu fiz várias anotações aqui em inglês, mas eu vou me expressar em português, vou pedir a ajuda do Garcês.
Sandro Alex has beautiful English, so he'll speak in Portuguese just to give me a hard time. Okay.
Imagine. Eu gostaria de voltar um pouquinho atrás para o tema da vingança. E aí fazendo uma comparação entre uma outra peça importante em que o tema aparece também como elemento principal, que é a Orestia de Ésquilo.
Okay, he wants to go back to the revenge theme, but now contrasting it to another play in which revenge plays a key part in the plot, which is the Orestia by Aeschylus.
Estrutura muito semelhante. Há um regicídio, o filho tem a obrigação de vingar o pai, os envolvidos são a mãe e o amante. A estrutura basicamente a mesma.
The structure is basically the same. The regicide, the father has been murdered, and the son has the moral duty to avenge his father, and his mother and the uncle are involved in the murder.
Mas o herói parece que é o mesmo e ao mesmo tempo é completamente distinto.
But the hero seems to be the same. It's completely different, the hero.
Porque Orestes em nenhum momento se questiona sobre qual é a sua obrigação. Enquanto que este questionamento é o que leva à inércia de Hamlet. A minha preocupação aqui, e talvez seja essa a questão que me interessa mais discutir, o problema não há mais um sentido claro de dever em Hamlet em função de uma ausência do sentido do costume enquanto banalização do mal, ou seja, a ruptura moderna entre moral e ética lança obrigatoriamente Hamlet numa ausência completa de referência transcendente, e isso que o coloca na inação e não à vontade. Me parece que não é um problema da vontade em Hamlet, mas um problema da completa ausência da referência a partir dessa ruptura entre moral e ética na passagem da Idade Média para a Idade Moderna. E, nesse sentido, eu gostaria só de acrescentar uma questão. Talvez o problema aí não seja um diálogo com a Idade Média. Me parece que o diálogo é realmente muito mais antigo. Nós estamos falando do costume como fonte do direito e que é alguma coisa anterior, inclusive, ao próprio cristianismo. É uma questão ligada ao talhão.
All right, so you correct me if I'm mistranslate your excellent question. So he's saying that, okay, the plot is the same, and that makes it even more striking that the heroes are so different. Orestes has no doubt in his mind whatsoever that he has a duty to avenge his father, so things go pretty straightforward from that on. And the traditional reading is that, of course, or the reading is that Hamlet is paralyzed by doubt, and he does not act because of that. Now, what Professor Sanderlex is suggesting is that maybe he's paralyzed not because it's not a matter of his will. It's not a matter of whether he personally he has the will or not to perform his filial duty of avenging his father, but because he is living in a time in which there is a separation between moral and ethics, right? So there is no point in this custom anymore. He's saying that he used the expression of the banality of evil, saying that, okay, well, this is a corrupt world, and so there's no point in my avenging my father, because in a way I think it goes back a little bit to what you mentioned this morning about Malcolm, saying, well, I'm equally evil, and so what is the point? I think that's a very interesting point, in the sense that what he's trying to do is say, okay, it's not. This is not something that hinges around Hamlet's willingness to do it, but the lack of meaning of doing it, and because he can see no moral sense for doing that. Is that correct? And
falta da referência.
Because there's no reference anymore, and he adds a second question or proposition to that. He says, well, and this also has to do with the fact that custom is no longer grounds for lawful action, and if this is the case in a society in which custom is gradually losing its ground as a legitimate foundation for lawful action, then maybe what we have to refer to is not the Middle Ages, but ancient times and the Greeks and so on. So two questions: whether Hamlet's indecision or indecisiveness may have to do more with a lack of moral sense in avenging any murder. Yeah, if I may, right? And when I discussed this, I mean, Hamlet's father is not actually a good guy, right? He was not actually someone you say, well, this was really a saintly man or something like that. So, right. So he was not really the greatest guy on earth. And as Professor Lemon refers to, I mean, I'm adding a little bit to what I'm saying, because I think Hamlet has been to Wittenberg, right, and Luther's thing, and that's basically it's a very negative reading of the human nature, right? That we are decayed, that we are perhaps beyond hope, if not for God's grace. I mean, by ourselves we are bad. So two things. Just for you to elaborate on this is, how do you see that Hamlet's indecisiveness has more to do with a lack of a moral framework for his action than actually a lack of willingness to do it, and whether if this is connected to the fact that custom is no longer a legitimate source of law, and then we have, if this is the case, we have to dialogue with the ancient times.
You improved the question.
No, I couldn't even understand it.
I think this is a very rich question you ask. One of the problems is caused by what I see as a disconnect in the play between the way Hamlet sometimes formulates the situation, where he has an idealized father, and from that point of view, Claudius is an absolute wretch. And there's a maximum contrast between Claudius and... In the closet scene with Queen Gertrude, he shows pictures of the two men. And he says this is like Hyperion, his father, to a satyr. This sexual maniac that you've married. But he also says, no more like my father than I, to Hercules. Now, in terms of that comparison, he's on Claudius's side of behavior. He's very imperfect. There's a disconnect, I think, between the actual Hamlet Sr., who said is cut off in the blossoms of his sin, and the idealized father that Hamlet is working with. Just as there's a disconnect between a kind of standard of behavior and authority and the way politics really operates by clashing ambitions and really dirty tricks and some of the nasty behavior that Hamlet himself engages in with regard to Polonius, mocking him and teasing him about his daughter, or treating the dead Polonius as a piece of garbage, or getting fascinated with Hamlet's fascinated with filth, worms eating the body of a dead king, or a fish eating the worms and a king eating that, and a beggar eating that, and a king going through the guts of the beggar. He starts to do a kind of speech, what a piece of work is a man, which gives you a version of Pico della Mirandola's oration on man, celebrating the beauty of the human being, the glory of nature, but also he drags it down to this quintessence of dust. So there's a problem in Hamlet between his need to idealize and to make stark differences between what he wants to be or wants to have been and what he recognizes the world is. Given that kind of messy situation where the idealization is unrealistic, and where at the other extreme, to some extent, his view of the world as a foul congregation of vapors, as just garbage, where's the real world? Which is a mixture of good and bad, which is a mixture of, not so bad, not so good. It's too extreme a view of things. Now, to act means to have some sort of fix on reality. And he doesn't have a very secure fix on reality. First of all, he's worried about the reliability of the ghost. It may be something that is generated by his own melancholy, and therefore some kind of mental disease on his part. It might be a devil come to tempt him to damn his soul. But then when the ghost gets proved to be telling the truth, when Claudius reveals his guilt in the play within a play, he's got to readjust the situation there. Okay, the ghost has told the truth. Now I can act. But then the next thing you see him doing is looking at Fortinbras passing through Denmark and wishing that he could act as forcefully as Fortinbras can. He can't do it still. The question of why Hamlet delays, the easy answer is Shakespeare needs a 5-act play. So it's like postponing two characters getting together and kissing and clenching and pledging love to one another. The longer you postpone it, the more action you get. That's a kind of dirty answer to the question. But the problem of delay has many, many aspects. Now, I think you have a very sensitive philosophical kind of reading of Hamlet's delay that comes out of your sophistication as a modern or postmodern person, sensitive to the nuances and ambiguity and the unrootedness of the world and the problems of finding anything settled in the way of consensus about law, morality, whatever. That's fine. I think the Shakespeare play leaves open that door for a modern reader and a modern audience. I don't think that would be quite the same thing that would go on in the Shakespearean audience. They would think more in terms of there are some pretty confusing religious signals being sent. A majority Protestant audience would say, what in the world is this ghost doing on stage? We don't believe in ghosts. We don't believe in purgatory. But then Hamlet seems to justify the existence of the ghost. It's not what Protestants want to be, a phantasm sent by the devil. So they're going to think more in terms of religious realities. They're also going to think in terms of what kind of a disease melancholy is. Hamlet labels himself as a melancholic. A melancholic is something that we might call a manic depressive or a borderline personality. They don't have quite that vocabulary, but they know that melancholics can't be trusted in their view of the world. Maybe to an extent. They're more sensitive to things that are wrong and they're good as social critics. They can go kind of crazy and expose things that we kind of like to keep hidden, but they're not mentally reliable. So they might say Hamlet's delay and his behavior is coming out of his melancholy, out of some sort of mental illness, as they understood mental illness as some kind of imbalance. You bring up a lot of stuff here that can lead to discussion, but for me it leads to starting to make distinctions between a modern understanding of this kind of behavior and this kind of action and an early modern one, which doesn't quite have the same kinds of categories that you're using. Yeah. Okay?
Good answer. Yeah, it's true. There are quite a number of ways into this. To pick up on the custom issue, one way of looking at the English attitude toward custom is a faith that human customs lead to right behaviors. That's why you have common law that comes out of customary practices. So people over time tend to develop the best, most rational responses, and that then becomes the source of law. And so in other words, a way of putting that is there's a lot of faith in custom because that's the basis of their legal system, and that legal system is a system that they presume to be rational, enlightened. And exactly as you say, the issue in Hamlet is that you have a custom more honored in the breach than the observance. So suddenly you have custom that stood on its head, and certain kinds of customs when it comes to reproduction of society, these become disgusting customs, right? So sex is no longer the way that society reproduces itself. It's actually the way we turn ourselves into garbage heaps, as Arthur was suggesting. Drinking customs are no longer something that bind people together. It's actually a way in which we undermine the nation, and we're now all called drunkards. So I think that going along with some of what Arthur suggested, we might say that this is a play in which the normal opposition between, say, human reason and bestial excess is collapsed, so that the very signs of human reason, law and custom, suddenly become signs of our material corruption. So that, and this is really just now dovetailing on what you were suggesting, where it's like the question, what if the political corruption in the state, and this may be the difference with the Oresteia. With the Oresteia, there's a sense perhaps that in enacting revenge, there'll be the resuscitation of a meaningful state and of reason and of dynasty and of family, and that these things, that there's a kind of architecture of the state that can be preserved so long as corruption is excised and revenge is taken. But that with something like Hamlet, the problem is the only moment of kind of society that we get outside of the corruption is maybe on the parapet, at the beginning of the play. That really we're in the trenches for most of the play. It's like we're in that kind of grave pit. And I think that one of the reasons that maybe Horatio comes out as, to the extent there is any idealized figure, it's because more is dreamt of in Heaven and Earth than in your philosophy. At least Horatio has a philosophy. At least he's kind of airy. He doesn't have these kind of material desires like Gertrude and Polonius and Laertes and even Ophelia. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that to get to the banality of evil or the corrupt world, I think the odd thing in Hamlet is that the corruption is actually our material bodies. And so when you begin to say corruption isn't just in Claudius, corruption is in the fact that I actually need to eat something. Corruption is in the fact that I actually sleep with someone. Corruption is in all of these very daily activities, and corruption is in materiality itself. We get to a kind of theological precept that certain folks, certain sort of radical Puritans might agree with, Calvin might agree with, but it makes for a really odd theater, because how can you be simultaneously staging everything through the body and yet suggesting that the only thing that's pure about us is perhaps our soul, and if only we can just shed these kind of clay lodgings. Shift off our mortal coil. So that, to me, may be one of the reasons why there's a distinction between you have a similar set of objectives, as you suggested, all of these comparisons, but I think we see in something like the Oresteia, they can't turn to the gods and to the soul, because the gods are actually just as kind of human in their desires, right? So there's an actual faith in the state, in state architecture. And I think we just don't see that in Hamlet, where there's a sense that what's the state created by? It's created by people. And what are people made of? They're made of atoms and materiality and drives that are all disgusting. So anyway, that's a rather dark answer, but yeah.
Let me add something about the question of custom. The philosopher of custom is one of Shakespeare's great villains, Edmund. In the speech in the second scene of King Lear, where he's explaining how he interprets his bastardy. Being a bastard means being outside the law, illegitimate, literally. He starts off his speech, "Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me, for that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines lag of a brother?" What he says is, what you have as human law defining who's a bastard and who's a legitimate child, all human law, all rules that people come up with are these arbitrary impositions upon nature. Nature is simply an arena of power struggle, and the strong survive. Custom is something that should not be respected. What he's speaking like what they called in the Renaissance a libertine naturalist, someone who does not believe in inherited Christian rules, Judeo-Christian rules, or in legal systems, and it's all arbitrary, and it's all gameable and manipulatable by the person. So he's a kind of extreme Machiavellian in this, but custom he regards as something that, or the curiosity of nations he calls it, is all human structures that have been developed to regulate human behavior, to discern what's legal and what's illegal, to create justice, whatever. It means nothing. So he's opening the way to a world of a war of everybody against everybody, of a radical individualism that is new in the Renaissance.
Just like Hobbes, in a way.
Yeah, state of nature.
Right.
State of nature.
Yeah, state of nature.
Well, and we still haven't even touched on the fact that we have 3 revenges going on in Hamlet, right? 3 guys trying to revenge their fathers. Is Paulo there? Now I have some lots of you. Juliana, you were here saying that you wanted to ask something, or is that it? No. Now that the ghost of Hamlet's father you're doing a project also or not? So no, he's just attending.
Just here because I'm passionate about Shakespeare.
All right. Okay. Wonderful. So I think that's the best.
Do you have a favorite play? Just curious.
What?
Do you have a favorite play?
Yes, Much Ado About Nothing. Just because our teacher here gave us a very, very interesting.
Aha! Yes.
Good. No, good. No. Yeah.
Now he gets to have the last word. We were speaking about Much Ado at lunch.
Right. Yeah. I really love it. And we were talking about appearance and reality there. That was something that I think we can come back to in today's debate if we have the time. So sorry, I had your name here. Didn't want to. It's okay.
That's Shakespeare's most famous play about the police.
All right, Gabriel.
Well, I'm just here just for.
So I thought, wanna add something to?
Well, I can make a question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's we're here for.
But we will have to. No, I don't. But we will have to go back to the. This is a gravação. Then.
Yeah, because Oscar upstairs he reviews every question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Big brother. Yes, the big brother Oscar. Well, going back to the discussion of the role of the woman in the plays, I was thinking here, and in the time of Shakespeare, I think we can put that after Henry VIII, we had the two queens, Mary and Elizabeth. And I'm thinking here that maybe the roles of the woman in the plays of Shakespeare are reflected by this appearance of the queen, yes, in the society that was basically made by men, in the kings, not a queen. And I was just, I don't know, trying to create this relation, because I think that just to get an opposition here, Elena, for example, she ends getting married, but Ophelia, for example, she suicides, and two women that are they live and exist in the same kind of society, in the same system, and have those two different, almost, yes, completely opposed ends.
One of the ironies about Ophelia is that she is forced to break off her relationship with Hamlet by her father, who says that you could never be the wife of Hamlet. Then when she's dead, the queen speaks over her body and says she hoped that she would have been Hamlet's wife.
Yes.
That's one of the ironies of the play. She could have married Hamlet in that play.
Ophelia is humiliated in that play. I mean, Claudio insults her in such a way that is, she's oppressed by her father and brother.
Right.
I mean, just on that point, I think you're right that there are many female figures who shadow a certain model of sovereignty that could be seen to parallel, say, Elizabeth, Olivia, Rosalind. I don't know, who else would we add? Titania. That's right, Titania. But it is a little peculiar. So we could start to think about those. But on the other hand, he also has Gertrude, Lady Macbeth. He has quite a number of women who he suggests might be a little too material for their own good in terms of their appetites for rulership. And so it's a little frustrating, I guess, as a Shakespeare critic, to think, I mean, hypotheticals, you know, as Shakespeare critics, we're really, really trained not to speak in hypotheticals. But I can't help thinking, why didn't he write a play with a female ruler? I mean, you have Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queen, that features very powerful female rulers. And, I mean, arguably, The Faerie Queen is kind of a donut in which we don't really get to the Faerie Queen herself, but you have Britomart. So anyway, that's not really an answer to your question, but it's I think it's more in like a way his audience might even have been wondering, like, why not? Why not have a play in which Titania is really the major character? Or why not have Olivia, instead of being in Illyria, which is like Elysium, which is sort of Nowheresville, why not have it be modern day something?
In Midsummer Night's Dream, the smartest characters are Helena, Hippolyta, the conquered Amazon wife of Theseus, maybe Oberon, king of the fairies, but there are two of the three certainly smartest characters. Hippolyta is the one who has a much more subtle sense of interpretation of human behavior than Theseus. She has a moral triumph over him late in the play in interpreting the experience of the lovers in the forest. Now, there's a difference between female characters in Shakespeare under Elizabeth and under James. He does things under James that he would not do under Elizabeth. He would never be able to write characters like Goneril and Regan, or even Lady Macbeth, under Queen Elizabeth. These are monstrous women who are villainesses. And you start to get, in the Jacobean theater, really high-powered female villains. You also get other things like exploration of incest as a phenomenon in the Jacobean and Caroline drama. So it matters who's on the throne, especially since a lot of these plays were commissioned for performance at court, and the Queen would have seen them. Unlike the movie Shakespeare in Love, which shows Queen Elizabeth showing up at the public theater. That's not the way it happened. The Queen would never have been in the public theater. But she could summon the players to court and have them perform. So, there's a play like A Midsummer Night's Dream, which may have been used at a wedding that was a courtly wedding, would have been viewed by the queen, so that putting two queens on stage, the Queen of the Fairies, Titania, and the Queen of, the equivalent, the Duchess of Athens in Hippolyta, would have, rung right.
Did you have a...
If we think about Margaret d'Anjou, it's a character that she is not a leader because she cannot, but she is a shadow leader. I don't know how to say that, but in a way she... If you could say something about it, if you think it's...
You're talking about a character in Henry VI? My memory is failing me.
Oh, but then Margaret's the one who is offering all those curses in Richard III, right?
Oh, okay, right.
But then earlier, that's right.
Yeah, there's a very good book on Shakespeare's history by a feminist scholar, Phyllis Racken, Shakespeare and the Stages of History. And she talks about how Shakespeare, very interestingly, lets women in these history plays articulate moral realities in a very forceful way. They have a lot of moral authority in these plays, and they're morally normative in many ways. It's interesting, you can talk about Richard II in this case, and how the Duchess gets to verify Henry's rule. Shakespeare lets women perform functions that command respect, despite the fact that they're subordinated, politically and within marriage, etc.
Yeah, that is a good point about Margaret, actually, that she is she's politically powerful, and then in the Henry VI plays, and then has, as Arthur's suggesting, sort of the weight of conscience on her. I mean, I think in Richard III, there, she also turns into a kind of proto-prophetess / kind of witchish, shrewy. There's something kind of interesting that happens to her that... But having said that, she really is the kind of voice of doom and righteousness, and to that extent, she's quite powerful. It's
All right, let me jump. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. I think you need a microphone here.
Also, in that point of women and sovereignty, perhaps one character that you can see, which, in my opinion, is the strongest female character in Shakespeare, is Portia. Portia, if Henry V is the king, Portia is probably the queen. Why I say she's the sovereign, and that also answers the question of why wouldn't you see the speech of I have ownership of my own body by Portia, because Portia doesn't need it. She is already the sovereign. Any rule that comes before her, she twists it, she bends it. She can do whatever she wants. She comes before a court, and she says anything. Everyone buys it. Her father makes rules for her to marry, and she just goes and I don't want you, I want that guy.
Right.
And then
she rigs the game.
Yeah, and I don't even think she loves. Perhaps she doesn't actually love Bassanio. You could even think that she wants someone easy, a pawn. She can do whatever she wants with him. She does whatever she wants with him. At the end of the play, she asks for the ring, and he gives it.
Now the issue of sovereignty over a body comes up in the play. Once she's married to Bassanio, she is operating by the rules of a wife in not having ownership of a body. In Christian marriage, the husband and the wife own each other's bodies. They cannot deny sex.
Yes,
in that relationship. But she rigs a game where she tells Bassanio, if you give away this ring, that authorizes her not to give sex to him. So she's got him right under her thumb in the last scene of the play until she reveals that, well, he gave the ring away to her. So in a way, she's taking back control over her own body, despite the rules of marriage, and then letting Bassanio assume the role of husband. But she can run circles around him.
You actually have a queen in Shakespeare. It's Portia. Actually, I think she's only weaker in her power of persuasion to Falstaff, perhaps, because Falstaff has the strongest power of the strongest charisma in all of Shakespeare characters. And
was pretty strong too.
If she's not weaker than Falstaff, she's on the same league as he is. So she is probably the best example of of a female sovereign in Shakespeare.
I mean, look, far be it from me to challenge the idea of female sovereignty, but I mean, right, the Wife of Bath. I don't know if any of you have read Chaucer's Wife of Bath, but that's a story in which there's a knight who commits a horrible crime, and he's meant to go off and ask, what is it that women want most? And he goes around the whole globe, and he can't find the right answer. And then finally he meets a witch who tells him the right answer is sovereignty. All women want sovereignty. So there is a kind of tradition of this, and I don't want to challenge that. But I might just ask you, and all of you, I mean, Portia is incredibly nimble when it comes to manipulating language, and she does, right, single-handedly solve the kind of Shylock-Antonio problem. But she does it while cross-dressed as a man, and in her position as woman, she has, I mean, I find this a really, really moving speech, but it's problematic, I suppose, from a sovereignty point of view, which is the speech where she says, "You see me where I stand, and in myself I am nothing but a poor, I can't remember, poor, paltry woman. And I'm happy with that. But for you, I wish I were 3 times richer, 10 times more beautiful." And, and she goes on about this, and then she says, at the end, "So I offer you everything that I am." And so it's a beautiful, beautiful speech. But if we're to take it from a kind of legal perspective, she is really offering herself entirely to Bassanio. And so I guess the point that the two of you are making is that she's simultaneously seeming to offer herself, and yet she is such a good, wily interpreter of language that she ends up wiggling out of that by, at the end, retaining sovereignty through this ring trick. I guess I just am a little more suspicious, both because a lot of the power that she exercises is when she's dressed as a man, and also because I think that the ring trick, to the extent that we take the circulating ring to stand in for the female body, I think that the ring trick simultaneously gives her sovereignty while also reinforcing the idea that the most powerful thing a woman has is her chastity. And so that really isn't about sovereignty. That's about, don't worry, I'm yours, I'm not going anywhere, I won't circulate. So anyway, and then we end with Gratiano's, I value nothing more than keeping safe Nerissa's ring. So anyway, I don't know. I'm happy to be attacked on this. I would love to see Portia as the perfect female ruler. I just think that maybe what we see with her is the necessity of navigating between a kind of female sovereignty on the one hand and within a society that needs her to concede some of that power, at least theatrically.
Which is not unlike what Elizabeth had to do, right?
Yeah, that's right. I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart is the stomach of a king.
But can I just add a question? But Elizabeth, as far as she was a strong woman, also she had the problem with the marriage all the time. She has get married to England because that was a problem to a woman, to a queen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
right. This constant discussion of the succession crisis. Right. Who are you going to marry? When are you going to marry? We have a right to say who you're going to marry.
There, and then I have Pedro here. You can go back there. Then Pedro, then Lucas. Okay, go on.
If I may reply to the point raised, Portia is not the perfect ruler. I think Shakespeare never indeed shows a perfect ruler, not even Henry V. They are all, even if the end they are only bad people, that would account for making them not the perfect ruler. But anyways, Portia, the point is she has to dress as a man to exercise her power, yes, but as she must play by certain rules to use her power, so must, for example, Henry himself. He must have the clergyman saying that he may invade France. They both must play by rules. And chastity, here she uses it. It's not as an asset. Chastity is also her power. The thing is, she knows how to use the tools she has, and that's what makes her a sovereign. Because the great sovereign, if you take as an example of the greatest Shakespearean sovereign for Henry V, he bends the rules. He can bend it to his will to do what he wants. He can bend it to invade France. He can relinquish friendships to send Falstaff away when he doesn't need him anymore. He can forget his father and then come back to become king again. And Portia can also do that. She has Bassanio. There comes two other guys before Bassanio, but there are rules constraining her, but she just says, I will play by these rules, but I'll make them as my own.
Yeah. One of the things that we can remind ourselves in terms of bending of rules is Portia, by the rules of her father's will, is not supposed to tell which choice to make of the caskets. So instead she recites a poem, Tell Me Where Is Fancy, bread in the heart or in the head, rhymes with lead. So she's not living up to the spirit of the will, but she's living up to the letter of it. And the same thing with Shylock. She's using the letter, the literal, a kind of mindless literalism. You get a pound of flesh, but no blood is included. It's not in the text. She's using that to a kind of advantage. But it's bad interpretation. It's manipulation of the rules. Yeah.
Well, no wonder she dressed up as a lawyer. Okay. All right. So we have Pedro and then Lucas. Okay.
My question will change the subject. Is it okay?
Sure.
Professor Arthur mentioned 3 elements of Hamlet's character. He said about he has an idealized father, and also that he has certain disgust for human nature, and that goes for extremes. And the last element he said about a certain melancholiness. My question goes for how much detachment can you see in this character in relation to Shakespeare? Because since he's the author of the play, I see him as a writer, inevitably, and writers tend to connect themselves with their characters and creating alter egos. But at the same time, you can have an objective criteria to evaluate the play. How alive is the character, or if he's only a soliloquy.
We don't know enough about Shakespeare's biography, but what we do know, relevant to Hamlet, is that Shakespeare had a son named Hamnet who died shortly before he did the play. We know that there's an association of melancholy with writerly sensitivity to the world, and even a hypersensitivity. He's dramatizing a hypersensitivity. I don't know, but I suspect that Shakespeare's drawing on emotional resources here in terms of a kind of entertaining a very depressed view of the world in a play like Hamlet that ultimately must come out of some kind of personal experience. But there's no way of showing that. There's no way of connecting it to anything more particular than the fact that he had a son who died, who had a name close to Hamlet. I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
No, I'm going to keep thinking about that. It's a really nicely phrased question, too.
I mean, for Freud, yes, this is right in the middle of Shakespeare's psychology. But he was formulating it more in terms of Oedipus complex and things like that. And I think
Hamlet's complex.
Yeah, right. And wrote that Hamlet and Oedipus. Ernest Jones wrote that Hamlet and Oedipus book. Jones was a disciple of Freud's. But you can speculate. Yeah.
It's fun speculation too, because anyway. So Lucas, please. Sorry, you were going to say something? Sorry, Rebecca. I cut you short.
Oh no. I guess the only thing on melancholy that I would say is I do think. Sometimes I think in some recent criticism there's been such an interest in humoral theory and accounting for Hamlet's melancholy in terms of his humors, and I guess I just don't find that quite. On the one hand, there have been all of these critiques of the kind of Freudian Jones reading via Oedipus, but on the other hand, I still think there's quite a lot of meat to that argument. And so sometimes to me, the most, like the idea that the Renaissance did not understand psychology except through the body and through humors, to me, I don't know how you feel about this, but to me it's interesting, but I don't think it's the only way. I think that there's far more going on.
If you could please just remind us of what the four humors were, when the theory was. I think that'll be interesting, right?
All right. They believed that the body had four basic humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And according to a predominance of any one of those humors, you have a certain kind of temperament. If you have blood as the dominant humor, you're sanguine, literally. I mean, sanguis for blood. You're optimistic, upbeat, energetic. If you have phlegm, you're phlegmatic, slow, slothful.
In Portuguese, we have the
lazy.
Word fleumático.
Yeah.
Fleumático is a guy
if you have yellow bile, you're irascible and angry and quick to temper. If you have black bile, literally, you have melancholy. You have, and that's the most interesting of the humors to them. So basically, ideal psychological health and physical health as part of psychological health is a good balance of all these four humors. If one of them, sanguine's okay, but if one of the others gets to dominate, you're out of whack, you're out of balance in your personality.
So then you have some analysis which would say a character like Hotspur is filled with yellow bile. He's choleric. Look at him. That's the only emotion that he has. Somebody like Hamlet is, as you suggest, melancholic. And so part of then his the challenge is to right the balance. I mean, so this was a period of time before Gabriel Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood, where they actually thought that humoral fluid was what traveled through our veins. So it was these kind of there was this fluid that was connecting us, and then each of these humors has a seat in a particular organ. But anyway, I guess I just wanted to throw that in there as kind of, I think as much as I appreciate kind of materialist readings of Shakespeare, I also think that the psychoanalytic readings, even though there's been the accusation that they're anachronistic, I think they can be really, really penetrating, and they can rely on some of the language that Shakespeare gives us that is just so far beyond. I mean, Hamlet's a good example. It's constantly lampooning the material. So the idea that that's a play that's entirely about, melancholy as it exhibits in the body, to me just isn't really convincing.
There's a psychoanalytic vocabulary for what I was talking about in terms of idealization and how things go wrong with excessive idealization. And that comes out of a tradition in psychoanalytic theory that is associated with what's called self-psychology and the work of Heinz Kohut and those who write about, they talk about it as narcissism. It comes out of the middle period of Freud, where Freud talks about the cathexis of the self, the investment of energy in the self. And he says there are two kinds of ways of relating to the world, through ego libido and through object libido. In object libido, you're recognizing what you are relating to and desiring as other, as something that is the not you. In ego libido, you're trying to read the object more in terms of what you are, to see it as a reflection of you. Both of these get mixed up, for example, in the experience of love. There are pathologies that go on in self-development in this psychoanalytic psychology. And one of the pathologies is excessive idealization and a resistance to recognizing what we all need to recognize about people who are closest to us, that they are a mixture of good and bad. This is related to what Freud wrote about late as the technique of splitting, where you see where a child, for example, and a lot of fairy tales are like this, will split a mother image into an all good, all loving, all caring figure and a witch and danger and persecutory figure. You see this splitting going on in fairy tales. The trick in maturational development is to put the good and the bad together, to see the person we're relating to as a mixture of good and bad, as likable and unlikable in some respects, and to be able to tolerate emotional ambivalence to another human being. What Hamlet does in his excessive idealization is he's trying to adhere to some kind of primitive notion of an omnipotent father in the face of evidence completely to the contrary, that his father left Denmark in a pretty messy state to begin with. It's not all because of Claudius. That he cut off in the blossom of his sins. He's not a god. He's created this kind of mythic image of his father that is out of touch with the evidence in the play. So this psychoanalysis we'll talk about as a kind of narcissistic pathology. I see that as a much more fruitful way to talk about what's being dramatized in Hamlet than Oedipal conflict, although he certainly is bothered by his mother having sex. Yeah.
I have a little comment. Oh, did you have a follow?
Okay. Yeah, let's just get things because we don't want you to go too far beyond our allotted time. So we're going to have Pedro and then Lucas and then Rodrigo. Is there anybody else? Yeah, and also Jorge. So anybody else? Do I have 10? Do I have? Okay. So I have just 4 more questions and then we can call it a day, right? Okay.
Just to try to advance what I was trying to say. If you have an author who has an emotional attachment to his character, it could lead to a way that the whole outlook of the character will convince us of his drama and all his conflicts. And then you read the book and you finish it and you get like, he's amazing, and it's incredible to see such an elaboration of what he's doing with his life. But then you deprive him of your moral judgment because of his charisma. And then you get to a point that you're making somehow a bad moral reading of the work because you cannot see the writer is convincing you somehow.
Okay. All right. So Lucas, can you go ahead? Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Coming back to Midsummer's Night Dream, but from another perspective, not the woman thing, but the modern medieval society. It's a very humble question. Was it a dream? And why I ask that is that we can see in reality, before the woods, the forest, that the woman is inferior to the man, although we can see examples of Hermia trying to assert her sovereignty. She cannot do that. In the forest, Titania owns Oberon. She is actually superior to Oberon. She's smarter, and Oberon tries to tell her what to do, but she doesn't do. And in the forest, there are not social rules. You know, they exchange love to one another. They switch lovers so quickly, and in a way that it goes like one person loves another, even though this another person has a donkey head, you know, and that's crazy because it almost has no social rules. And when they wake up, things seem to be back to normal, but there are there's an aftermath. There are consequences of what happened in that night. So there was this crazy thing that happened that night. You would think that it would not leave consequences. It was just that night, but it did, and it had an impact in their lives.
You're bringing up the central issue in Midsummer Night's Dream. First of all, Shakespeare is forcing us to take dreams seriously. So is Hippolyta. Theseus says the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Once you get into fantasy and imagination, it's all nonsense. It's all trash. She says, no, the four young people have told the same story together, and it grows to something of great constancy, which is a way of defining a kind of set of fantasies or imaginative materials that one will present in a play or in a fiction as something to be taken seriously, as expressing a kind of reality and an insight into where the world works or people behave that you shouldn't just dismiss because it's not real. It's not, it's not factual. Shakespeare is working against a couple of metaphors here that he's invoking in the play. One is in the speech that Bottom makes after he wakes up. He's taking a passage from St. Paul, mangling it. Eye hath not heard or ear hath seen, whatever. But he's referring to a passage in St. Paul where St. Paul talks about how we cannot imagine the supernatural in heaven and the mysteries that God has. They are alien to us and are a limited understanding of the world, but we need to take them seriously. At the end of the play, you have an epilogue spoken by Puck, where in effect he's saying to the audience, if we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. So audience, you've just seen it, you've just been asleep and you've had a dream. This gets used in The Taming of the Shrew also as a metaphor. And this calls back a kind of metaphor that you find in La Vida Sueño. Life is a dream. A perspective on human life that kind of displaces your sense of reality from the concrete here and now and kind of what we think of as realistic perception of things and says, a lot of this may be illusion, and in terms of a comparison to a world of the supernatural, it may be less real, less substantial. In fact, a lot of medieval drama drives home that point, that what really counts are the mysteries of faith, God, heaven, whatever, and what we go through every day in our daily business is kind of poof, it evaporates. So there's a defense of the imaginative that's going on in the play. And, the play, what goes on in the forest is very silly. What happens when the four lovers wake up includes having one of them still with the juice in his eyes, not given the antidote. So Helena marries a drugged man who's not in his right mind. But it doesn't matter. What else is love but some kind of goofy drug we take? It's a play that's questioning the limitedness of the kind of point of view of the character Theseus. He wants to be in a world of proof, of rationality, of clear rules, of being in possession of I know what's real, I know what's not real. He's not as smart as Hippolyta, and he's certainly not as smart as an imaginative writer like Shakespeare.
But can't we look at this play in a social change perspective? I mean, you can compare this play to social revolutions, not trying to judge them if they're right or wrong, good or bad, but like if you can compare this play to the Primavera Árabe.
Yeah, the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring.
Yeah.
That they have this beautiful, silly thing that's going on, that everybody's loving it. You don't know what's going to happen. And then comes the next day. And on the next day, there's the aftermath. So this happened, what are you going to do?
And that's what literature allows us to do, to respect the integrity of imagination and the kind of function of imagination in the thinking and the experiencing that we go through in life.
I realize we have a couple other questions, so I'll keep this brief. But just to reinforce this point, because I think that underlying what Arthur is suggesting is a challenge to one way of reading dreams, which is through someone like Bakhtin. So Bakhtin gives us this theory. He's a Russian theorist who suggests that there's this period of the carnivalesque. And the carnivalesque is where we have society, the world turned upside down. We see this in Twelfth Night. We might see it in Midsummer Night's Dream. All these things are possible. You suddenly have the pauper as the king, and you have the king as the pauper. But the thing that Bakhtin theorizes is that then official culture comes in and puts its stamp back on. And so it's like the purpose of the weekend or the purpose of blowing off steam. Oh, yes, we'll let people go out at night and get really drunk because they need to, be in the office first thing 9 a.m. Monday morning, and they need to have that stamina. And I think what Arthur is suggesting is not that fantasy and dreams and the carnivalesque is actually co-opted by official culture, but that actually things get done in dreams. So it's not just something that is inconsequential. And I think I would just really agree with that it could be true at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream that there's a sense, okay, this was a dream, this was a trying things out. But who was sitting there for 2 hours watching everything happen in Midsummer Night's Dream? We were. So that's the kind of, so it has a reality to it. It has a material reality. We've just seen it on stage. So that's actually quite exciting. And I suppose it's like the possibility of the Arab Spring or of Occupy Wall Street or of any of these things where it's like, how can you simultaneously dream and be eminently practical, right? You have to have the people who are willing to dream. And then you can have the people who come in and are really good at the skilled practical implementation of that dream. But it starts with the dreamers. I would agree.
Right, great. I'm really sorry to hurry things up. Also have two more questions, right? Rodrigo and George, and then we're going to call it a day.
I will talk about what. Oh, where is the guy that was here? It vanished into the air. Oh my God! Well, he has this question about the connection with writer and the character, and Shakespeare. If Hamlet had some of Shakespeare inside it. I will ask one question that always have been on my mind. I read in somewhere, I don't know where, that it was one speculation that in one possible play of Shakespeare, in Hamlet, in the time of his writing, there was Shakespeare would be not only a writer, but he could always be an actor in a play. The ghost, that's the point. In Hamlet, he would have played the ghost, and the speculation is something like this. If he had played the ghost, is it possible that he had played to either the character of the actor king in the middle of the play, the mousetrap, the murder of Gonzago? It would be to facilitate, I don't know how to say. Doubling roles. Yes, doubling roles, something like that. And what I was trying to say to the guy that disappeared is that in a very strange way, some of the words that are spoken in the Murder of Gonzago, the play inside the play, were written by Hamlet, and in one way, Shakespeare as an actor would speak those words that were written by Hamlet. So there is something about who wrote it. Who wrote it? Who is the writer and who is the character? And yes, that's my. That's what Hamlet could have wrote it. Hamlet. That's it.
Shakespeare also played the role of Portia's father. He's the one who wrote the mechanism that produced the play.
Interesting. I wish he were here to be able to respond.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful. Okay, so then, please, George.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I was just wondering, when we were talking about the role of suicide in Hamlet, and I was thinking how we could connect this to law. And I don't know, I'm not sure, but I'm just conjecturing that Professor Rebecca was speaking about a fascinating, I would say a brilliant thing, which was the interpretation of justice in Hamlet, when you said about something about the New Testament and the Old Testament. And I was wondering if, suicide has a relationship evidently with death, and when we think about legal change, when we need to change law, we need to face death. We need to see. We need to realize that the old law, or the Old Testament, I would say, is dead, and a new law has arrived. And I was thinking, do you both think there is any relationship between legal change and the mess which was Hamlet's mind at that time? He was very confused about the role of justice. I don't know if he would say, I don't know if God will use my body, use me as an instrument for a certain fulfillment, or I would act as the Talian law. I don't know. As the Talian law. I was thinking about that. Maybe could Shakespeare be speaking about legal change, and what's the relationship between legal change, death, and the idea of a transition, of the idea of how justice can be fulfilled in Shakespeare's time? I don't know if I made myself clear, and I don't know if this is a very easy question. Anyhow,
I don't know. I'm going to ask Rebecca.
That's a really dense question. The thing that came to mind when you were outlining these features is right. What if we read the play as an allegory with Hamlet as law? Hamlet is a figure of law, forced to institute change. When you said he's an instrument, right? One of the things is law has a kind of instrumentality to it, a kind of a force behind. And so is this, so that's just something for us to meditate on before tomorrow. But I guess from a historical vantage point, I think, if we were to phrase your question with the kind of meta question of why would Shakespeare write a play like Hamlet in 1600, 1601, that is so much about changes in custom, fears about innovation, the interplay between old and new orders. And I think that, positioning, and we've talked quite a lot about this today, positioning Shakespeare at the end of a century that is so filled with incredible legal change that the country had never seen before, where, in 1534, you have the Reformation Parliament that basically legislates the king's ownership of monastic property, of all of these things that had belonged to the Catholic Church. He re-legislates treason. He re-legislates, he creates a new church. So if we're thinking about sort of English attachment to custom and fear of innovation, and yet they're having to endure really a century of tremendous legal change and the literal and figurative deaths that come from that. The ones that we've spoken about today at the hands of Mary and I thought that was a fascinating statistic that you brought up about Elizabeth with the 270 deaths, recusant deaths. 180. 180 versus 300. Right. But But I do think that from that point of view, and Foucault would suggest this too, that law and death are very much coupled, not only in specific statutes about treason or about estate seizures, but a death of an old order. And so then to see Hamlet as kind of the melancholy of the modern world, and we're certainly not the first to say that, but to attach that to legal change is it's quite an interesting prospect.
Okay, all right. So couple of things. I think that one of the things that makes it so fascinating is that, of course, every age is an age of transition. It's a truism to say that. We're always changing, but not every age is an age of rupture and breakdown. And I think that maybe ours and Shakespeare's time, they are breakdown moments. Very briefly, I want first to thank you all. I think it was splendid student participation, just outstanding, and our colleagues. And second thing is that it reinforces my notion that that great scholars, really great scholars, are always very elegant in their way of addressing the issues, and I thank you both for that. I thank everybody for coming. It's been a long day, but I think a very profitable day. Tomorrow we're going to have at 9 o'clock, it's not 8:30, and hopefully it won't be raining, so it's going to be a bit better. At 9 o'clock, Professor Lemon will be talking about Shakespeare's Richard II, which is a very interesting play, of course, and Elizabethan politics. And Ronaldo will be debating, and we will be jumping in with our comments. I thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone. Okay.